my grandparents had a lending library in Otwock, Czytelnia Sławina, na ulicy Warszawska 17. That's what my mother always said. And he remembers going there. And then, as a final paragraph of the book, it's elegiac. It's so tender. He's leaving to go to the United States. His parents were in the Yiddish theater, and they traveled all over the world, really. And eventually they go to the United States and are able to send for him in the 1930s, which right there is a miracle, isn't it? And he says he's leaving to go. I think he was 10, 11, 12, 13, like that. That taxi, however, was carrying me away not only from the SS Leviathan and Manhattan's waterfront, he's arrived, it was also taking me from the world in which I'd grown up. There were now new challenges before me, new experiences, new expectations, new aspirations. I was turning my back almost deliberately on my old way of life. My parents' ties to their relatives and friends in Europe were loosening as well. All three of us would soon forget those we had left behind. We would become preoccupied with our own needs, our own problems. The tragedy of the Second World War helped remind us of what had been. Indeed, later, we were to meet again some of the survivors of the horrors of genocide. Yet even then I remembered my childhood years only fitfully and infrequently. Perhaps I preferred not to remember them. But now, in my old age, I think more and more of those among whom I lived 70 years ago. I think of them, I remember them. I see them before me more clearly than ever. You are always with me, I would like to say to them. You belong to me. You are part of my innermost being. Perhaps someday we'll meet again in another realm, a higher realm, where the distinctions between the old world and the new, between the past and the present, between the living and the dead are irrelevant or non-existent. All of them will be there. My grandmother and Rivka, Yaja, Hala, Katya and Kasia, Mr. Sławin, and that's my grandfather, and Mrs. Schweigerova, my mother remembers her, Sevus Prager and Jurek Gabinet, and many, many more. There will be embraces, greetings, tears, laughter, reflections, and reminiscence of life long ago in a vanished world. Yet, could this happen? Is it really possible? I can't be sure, but I certainly hope so. I hope so with all my heart. It's tender, isn't it? And I mean, he speaks for any of us, and the desire to be reunited with people that we love. And in my father's remembrance of Pietrovich, it's a similar impulse, isn't it? He remembers so vividly and so tenderly, but the portrait of my grandfather he's characterized as the genial Mr. Sławin, the genial librarian. What became of him, he writes in the book. And when I found the book, thanks to the internet, I was able to speak with him, call him and speak with him and tell him what became of Mr. Sławin. He has a great-grandson who is named for him. a boy who is now 20 years old. And who's coming here tomorrow.
Can you tell me, did your parents were telling you a lot about living in life in Okhotsk before the war?
Well, you know, I somehow always knew about some things. For one thing, when you are 4 years old, you begin to read numbers, right? You learn your numbers. And so I saw the numbers on my father's arm. So I remember quite distinctly asking him about them. Why do you have numbers on your arm? And he was very matter-of-fact about it. But my father made light of things, you know. He didn't want to trouble us, and he just laughed and said, oh, a blonde man put them there. And when I said, did it hurt? He just shrugged his shoulders. But my mother said that father had been in concentration camp. But, you know, what does that mean? But there weren't grandparents. We had a very small family, and it was clear my parents spoke with an accent, with quite a pronounced accent, and my mother had terrible nightmares. She would cry out. And so we knew pretty quickly that they had a history. I'll tell you when my father started revealing more. In 1962, well, you know the history American history, surely, and the intensifying of the civil rights movement from the 1950s. Well, it began from the moment of enslavement. People were resisting. But following the Supreme Court decision to outlaw separate but equal in the United States, there was a movement. Well, there were several things that happened. One of the things that happened in the American South is that many of the white communities, rather than desegregate the schools, which is bring black students and white students together, simply closed public schools and created private schools for white children, which meant that black children were not continuing education. So the American Friends Service Committee, this Quaker organization, it's a movement pretty well known for its pacifism, organized families in the North in good school systems to host students who couldn't go to school in the South. So we had a student who stayed with us, Moses Scott, and he was 18 years old, we were 10 years old. But it was at that point that my father began to talk much more frankly about what had happened during the war, because he felt an immense affinity with Moses. For one thing, the reason our family was chosen to be a host family in 1962 was because my parents were very frank when they were asked what motivates them to have a black student in their home. They said, well, we survived Hitler. We are very acquainted with the consequence of racism, and this is the least we can do. Make some witness, participate as actively as we know how to show that such notions of racial superiority are utter nonsense. So my parents were always activists, but I remember somebody came, a junior high school teacher came with his students to interview my father, and there I listened with wide eyes to his many stories. But his stories were inevitably very humorous because that's how he dealt with things. But it was, and then, you know, we knew my mother had a twin who died, who was killed under unhappy circumstances. And I don't know, somehow there were shadows, you know. There are photographs. We were lucky enough to have photographs because my mother's aunt had gone to Brussels to be educated in the 30s when she couldn't be educated here in Poland. And we had photographs from an uncle who went to Palestine in the 30s, and even a letter from my grandmother. But here we have photographs, but no people living who are connected to these photographs. So there were stories instead. But so little by little, the story unfolds. And as I developed as a person, I wouldn't say I was inordinately obsessed, but with finding out what happened, but books came into my life. After all, I'm a librarian by profession myself, but what did Mother say? Mother said, "We were born to books," in her thick Polish accent. I remember her saying, "We were born to books." So, does that answer your question?
Yeah, but I want to know more. If you can just tell me more, what kind of people they were, because you were talking about that involvement into some kind of
civil rights.
Civil rights.
Absolutely. They were very clear about their social convictions, let us put it that way. They had a vision of goodness, which came from their parents. And they were frankly idealists, unabashed idealists, and very deeply principled. You can imagine what they said in 1964 when my beloved government, it was clear to my parents that this whole Gulf of Tonkin crisis was contrived to justify sending more arms to Vietnam. My parents, they had been through all the propaganda of the 1930s, and they knew very well that it was that. And then, of course, you know, in retrospect, it's very widely known that this was a crisis that was contrived to justify American escalation. It's a real heartache for us because here I'm raised in the United States, a country, of course, that I love, a history that I identify with. But it's a heartache that our lofty principles as a nation need accounting to, and as a loyal citizen, I feel a great sense of responsibility to do the work of making sure that our nation lives up to its lofty principles of equality and assuring a life for all people that is good. So we have a particular work to do right now where the U.S. immigration policy is, I can only say, misguided is a nice word, but I see parallels from the 1930s, separating children from their parents, refusing to acknowledge that these people come as refugees because they are not safe in their own country. Sounds familiar to me. And now you are asking me about what Matan Shefi found. I never knew this, that in fact my mother's aunt, Schenka Willendorf, it's a very well-known story about Abram Willendorf because of Tzalel Perehodnik's book that was published, how il a sauvé l'honneur des Juifs d'Otfotsk. That's I read the book in French at first. Abram Willendorf went to his death with his wife Schenka, but just this last Monday I discovered, thanks to what is it called, JICH, that there is a record of them applying to emigrate to the United States. I had no idea. And also, in this trip I'm making, I discovered, again, this wonderful network of decent human beings, and there are so many. There is a man in Otfotsk right now. His name is Zbigniew Nozovsky, and he has worked tirelessly to acknowledge the history of the Jewish community that, well, we can say was decimated during the years of Hitler. And I went to meet him last Saturday, and all kinds of stories poured out, partly because we're so lucky as to have photographs. And my mother grieved her whole life, our whole lives, the terrible deaths of her family and her community. How do you not? It's, the French word, cafard, ineffable, there are no words for this anguish in a human being that loses somebody to violence and to hatred. You see, that's in many ways why my parents had a very strong identification with Black people in our country, because to this day, there is a kind of, it's not called lynching anymore, but it is a lynching when a young Black person just gets shot on the street, or I'm sure you hear the reports of these things. But here I was having this meeting Mr. Nozovsky for the first time, and I don't know where the story came from about Abram Willendorf, but he said, "Really? Abram Willendorf was your great-aunt's husband? Oh, I know Willendorfs. I know them." So on Monday, I met his nephews who live here in Warsaw. I never knew that. And when we met, you can imagine what it is to meet. And at first I didn't know, is this the same family? But they told the same stories from a slightly different perspective. They had heard the same stories, po polsku, in Polish, whereas I, of course, heard them from my mother in English. But the stories jibe, is that the word? So, I should probably read you a very beautiful letter that my mother wrote. She was always writing letters to the local newspaper about political matters. And you probably remember there was quite a controversy maybe 20 years ago about the nuns at Auschwitz, and people were very angry about that. But my mother has I think, a very important perspective. I should read you the letter because it's her words. It was published in the Boston Globe, the newspaper of record. Let me find it for you, if you have the patience.
Of course.
You're very sweet. Are you taping all of this emotional stuff?
Yes.
Oh dear.
It's
but you can edit it, right?
Yes, but I will not edit it.
Well.
Because this is our principle. We keep just the whole. I mean, of course, if you will have a wish to edit.
Oh, that's right. I signed a paper that says.
You have right, of course, to do that.
Well, what might I edit? I don't know. I think, what the last words my mother said before she died almost a year ago, I'll never forget. She called out in English and then in Polish, I love. And I went to her as she was calling out. And then I think, I'm not sure, but I think she said, "Ja spać." It will take me a while to find it because it's a copy of a copy. And now that we carry our lives in the palm of our hands, but I'll find it. Maybe we should read her poem about the nursing school, because that is the most extraordinary thing. Actually, I can also read you something very beautiful that she wrote about Otwocka. You see, here she is, Moja mama. It will take a bit, because I'm going to have to get good light for us. It's dated August 31st, 1989. And it's titled Holocaust Memories. When I saw the photograph of a small group of American Jews being dragged away in Auschwitz, protesting the building of a cloister on the grounds of the former concentration camp, bitterness rose within me. They always hated us, I thought, but then I remembered the Polish peasant who led a few Jewish boys away from the area in my hometown, Otwocka, where Jews were being rounded up on August 18, 1942, for the death camp in Treblinka. I remember my Catholic friends who sheltered me on the day of my rescue. A stranger who rode with me all the way from Warsaw to Lvov, where I hoped to survive among darker-skinned Armenians and Ukrainians. I pray that the cloister in Auschwitz becomes a shrine like the Peace Pagoda in Leverett, Massachusetts, to the martyrs of all religions and races. I choose to follow Anne Frank's belief. There is goodness in us all. Stella Pencer, Newton. That says it.
Beautiful.
Moja mama. Moja droga mama. But let's read her poem, because that, to me, is the most beautiful thing. And then maybe my father's lovely account of Pan Pietrovich. But that again, you know, I think I lived with my mother these last almost 6 years, because as she was turning 90, it was clear that she couldn't live alone. Of course, she wanted to live in her own house. She was fiercely independent, like elderly people often are. And we had made a promise to my parents that we would always stay together. You know, that's partly the legacy of Shoah. We couldn't stay with our parents. We parted under horrible circumstances. We must stay together. So that was our responsibility. There are 3 of us, myself, my twin brother Daniel, Joseph, his name, Yusef was my father's father, and Rosita Eve, Rosie, as we call her, younger sister, 4 years younger. She, her name is a compound of Rose and Ita. Ruja, who was Rosalia was my father's mother, and Ita was his, he called her Mawa Babcha. He adored her. So, and also he had a girlfriend, Ruja, whom he lost terribly. But it was our commitment to our parents that we stay together. So as Mom was turning 90, and it was clear she really needed to be nurtured, she came to live with me in Vermont, in Burlington, Vermont. My beloved Monge said, yes, we must take your mother in and we'll give her the best life we know how. And it was splendid to live with her in those years. Yes, she was diagnosed with dementia, but people with dementia have soul and spirit. I learned so much in those years. Do I have regrets? Of course. I wasn't always patient. And nursing an elderly person, I have such respect for people who even know how to help an elderly person move and toilet himself. You know, because certain things, personal hygiene, becomes a matter of necessary supervision, and, you know, to be able to do these things with patience and dignity. I'm not sure I always pass the test, but her forgiveness, I believe, is absolute, Mother, my dearest one. So let's read her own poetry. These are poems that she began, you know, she was not a, what's that one? She was a Grzypurek?
Grzypurek.
Yeah, I just learned this word. She didn't take herself seriously as a writer, but I took her seriously. Just listen. Nursing school, spring 1941. Whenever I hear the Chopin Piano Concerto No. 1, I see you, Zosha Wilner, freckled, innocent, bent over the smuggled instrument. The sundown becalming yet another day in the ghetto. The weary light seeps through the window. The notes arise, now linger, now descend, in search of the horizon. They sculpt a path in the spring that is forbidden us. Zosha, my comrade, the folk-spun subtleties of Chopin ply us with elation. Soon Irena, in confluence with piano, lifts her red head soprano. This spontaneous duet holds me in thrall. I will not fall, victim of forgotten moments. What happened was, again, we are so blessed. In New York City, in the 80s, I think it was Ivo. I think even, what is the director of your museum? Barbara
Kirchenblatt Kimberly. I mean, she was the main curator of the core exhibition.
Well, she had a part in mounting an exhibit which became a book called Image Before Our Eyes, or Image Before My Eyes, something like that. And I invited Mother to come and see the exhibit. I was living in New York at the time. You're familiar probably with the book, but I'll never forget how she exclaimed at one of the photographs, "Oh, this is our sitting room in Kista, the nursing school sitting room." And there's a photograph of some young gals reading, and a piano in the corner. And this is how she came to write this poem. I'll never forget her moment of recognition. And then she wrote another poem, which I love. You see, I really am her promoter, you might say. Am I not?
Yeah.
Because I love her, you know. And she was modest herself. But this is, I don't have to translate the Latin for well-educated Polish people who probably still study Latin, but Mother translated it. But I'll just read it without comment because this audience is more apt to understand the references. Tribute. Arma virumque cano, sang Virgil. The Roman bard's fame I do not aspire. Armaments I neither cherish nor admire. Onward with a fervent tribute to my elders and my peers that has germinated many years. The night curfew, a listless morning, began to meet as we strode Želazna Street, skirting the dead like puddles of rain, lest our nursing uniforms despair stain. At first, a shroud of newspapers anchored by stones, the dead respected as their numbers multiplied. This right was neglected. Only the rains wept over the infamy of starvation. Only snowflakes outlined in white convocation the shapes robbed of life. From the shelter of American shore, some professors opined we should have resisted Nazi onslaught more. One day of ghetto existence, Dayenu, did it not merit a badge of resistance? Oh, my mates, Żaba, Zosha, Hanka, Felka, Margos, Alina Margolis, head up, your steel-rimmed glasses a-sparkle, straight-shouldered, bright. On your days off, you went to the Aryan side. Aryan, the hitherto innocuous term pulled out of the thicket of anthropology, became a standard bearer of Nazi ideology. Again and again, you outwitted the sentries that guarded the ghetto entries. Jewish militia in respectable distance from Polish police, Latvian guards and Nazi SS men. How eager were we for news from the rest of Warsaw in the river Vistula's embrace, old city's dusty streets, the curly passageways, the broad arteries of compassion devoid as we, Warsaw's stepchildren, were being destroyed. November 1940. I recall the clip-clop of horses pulling our cargo toward the newly enclosed ghetto. We, nursing students, piled on trunks tied with rope, bid goodbye to our quarters at the whitewashed hospital on Chiste, but not to hope. We shall return, our nurses' caps adorned with coveted stripe. Believe, believe you must, this season of malice will pass. The song we composed for the capping ceremony, the end of 3 months probationary period. Director Luba Bielitska, your staff. Pani Scheinmanova, Sisters Neuhaus, Leiwand, our mayordomo Salce. We took your grit for granted as you coped with shortages, restrictions that never relented. The pursuit of our nursing skill made all other aspects of life in the ghetto less real. To perform our tasks, lege artis, was the goal. Alumni, you recognize the call. The years 1940, 1942, a millennium. My elders, my mates, your strength, your hangman's humor never did tire, facing the shadow of the funereal pyre. That is her eyewitness at a remove for, 40 years maybe. Those are her words.
She was writing in Polish or in English?
This is in English. Her fourth language. Because, of course, her parents spoke Yiddish at home, but she didn't want to speak Yiddish. She wanted to be a Polka, and it saved her life later because she didn't speak Polish with Yiddish intonations and inflections. So Yiddish, Polish, she learned German in school, Latin, French she learned after the war because she went to Brussels. Well, English is her sixth language. But, you know, she got a good education in gymnasia.
But in your home, your parents were speaking Polish or Yiddish?
I spoke Polish. They loved Polski język. Loved it. There were always books in Polish. Mickiewicz and Julian Tuwim, of course, was closer to my mother. But Pan Tadeusz, all the classics. Dear, dear parents. But they didn't speak to us in Polish, so we really didn't learn because, well, for one thing, they needed privacy. Parents need privacy. But also, they, like many immigrant parents, they wanted us to grow up without such trauma, without the taint of tragedy. Because let's face it, Polish history is difficult. It is a difficult legacy in so many dimensions.
So, I'm wondering, for you, when you came first time to Poland with your mother?
Well, this is a marvelous question because, in fact, it relates to the letter I read to you earlier. She mentions the Peace Pagoda in Leverett, Massachusetts. Now, Buddhist monks from the order Nipponzan Myohoji, which was founded in Japan, are very committed pacifists. And they believe that you have to go and pray and fast in places of conflict. Their work of outreach and education is exemplary to my mind. Well, and you see, Mother, in 1989, she cites them as, as exemplars of reconciliation, of equality, of peaceful coexistence among nations, among nationalities. These are principles so fervently held by my mother. She always spoke of her parents as being internationalists, which I guess has difficult nuances sometimes in some cultures. But for us, it's the highest principle, not to harbor these petty chauvinist ideas. She saw what chauvinism to the extreme can do to human beings. And she was very outspoken when she heard any taint of it anywhere. She spoke up. She was well known in Boston. "Oh, your mother's written another letter to the Boston Globe," people would say to us. But I respected her very much. But Nipponzan Myohoji, in 1994, yes, in the spring of 1994, I happened to see a sign at the Friends Quaker meeting. I don't know in what measure your audience will be familiar with the Religious Society of Friends, Quakers, but German people know them because of the Quaker Speise, and they were eventually given the Nobel Peace Prize for their efforts to feed German children post-World War I, and advocated that that a peace treaty should not be punishing and vengeful, that vengeance is a recipe for intractable conflict and war. Vengeance is a toxin, is a poison. It just perpetuates a cycle that never ends and that becomes self-justifying. These are my mother's principles, that you know, you can see I'm thoroughly imbued with. And I would say my siblings too, absolutely. But anyway, I saw this sign, convocation at Oswiecim. Well, when I saw the word Oswiecim, I had to pay attention. It's not a word that's commonly used in English, as you know. The camp is known by the German name. But when I saw that, I had to investigate. Well, there were two things that were happening. I was very disturbed by the tenor of commemoration. We were moving towards the 50th anniversary of D-Day, and I was very uncomfortable with the spirit of triumphalism. Well, on ethical principle, you know, you don't, it's not a way to make peace by getting the upper hand ultimately. The war was won at a terrible cost. And what is unleashed by war? The atomic bomb. And that's a whole other history and question. But anyway, when I saw that sign, Oswiecim, and what it proposes, that people from all over the world gather for meetings in Oswiecim at a Center for Reconciliation that's funded by the German government. And this meeting was convened by these wonderful Japanese monks. And I was able to participate, partly, in great measure because of Quakers who helped fund me. And I myself in my adult life have been very active with Quakers because of their pacifism, because of their inclusivity, because the manner of worship is so simple and without arcane rite, R-I-T-E, and loving. You know, it's the manner of worship is we gather in silence and open our souls to God. That's as simply put as I can say it. My mother raised Quakers. Curiously enough, I can say that. Well, partly because of the civil rights witness and then the anti-war witness, which was very close to my mother's heart. But anyway, so these wonderful Buddhist monks propose that we go to Oswiecim, and that in their concept of remembering, we need to remember what happened in a spirit of reconciliation and determination that we are responsible, that it doesn't happen again. And to that end, these ambitious people, in the best sense of the word, propose that we have to walk from Auschwitz to Hiroshima through places of contemporary conflict. Now, of course, we know geography well enough that we're not going to walk all this way, although, you know, strictly speaking, I suppose, had we marched across Siberia, maybe we could, or Iran, but we didn't. We flew part of the way. But to that end, people from South America, descendants of Nazis, German people came, a large contingent of Americans, large contingent of Japanese people, a few, but not many Polish people. Some people from Europe, from Holland, from Serbia. A woman came. The war was still going on. But anyway, so I was able to participate and form, well, that was how I happened to go for the first time to Oswiecim, under those auspices, the only auspices that I could go, non-sectarian, inclusive, universal in its outlook. And for the first week, mother, Stella Pencer, Zadomo Swavin, came with me. And this was the first time that the first and only time since 1945 that she returned to Poland. We arrived at Okęcie and took the bus because, of course, I had the supreme advantage of her Polish speaking. Oh, did she love to speak Polish? She just swam. It was wonderful and difficult at the same time. And we made our way to Śródmieście and took the train to Otwock. Just as she remembered, the PKP, the pociąg. And at first, when we got off the train, she was completely disoriented. Well, you can imagine, arriving there. This is 1994. She hadn't been back for practically 50 years. She hadn't been back since August of 1942, and you know what conditions there were there. I didn't dare ask her last memories. She kept saying, I feel like Rip Van Winkle. Now, who is Rip Van Winkle? He's a legendary figure in American, not even folklore. Fenimore Cooper wrote a story about Rip Van Winkle, who goes to sleep for, I think, 40 years and wakes up and is completely disoriented. Mother was very literary, but, after all, both my parents, they had a good, solid Polish classical education. They studied Latin, they studied history, geography, languages. They were educated people. I give credit, and they always gave credit to their education for Matura. But I'll read you another poem because, in a kind of way, it's fascinating. How did Mother get her bearings when we came to Otwock? Let me see if I can find it here. I love her poems. You're very nice to let me read them because yes. And I think it says something better than I could ever explain it myself. It's called Childhood in Poland, Ambivalence. We were little. The world was a bilingual harmony. Konik, Ferdele, Ptaszek. Fegele. At the crossroads of Otvotsk, a monument of worried Jesus Christ faced the better part of town, where rainwater tamed by pavement did not frolic in the gutter, and Yiddish was hidden like a flawed offspring. The right arm of Christ pointed away from the shtetl. On Friday, wary windows blinked with the promise of Sabbath. The mirage of Europe was viewed with detachment by the pious. The school for children, separate but equal. In the primer, Yannick and Alla did not meet Shmulik and Chanele. The Polish patriot Berek Yoselewicz walked desultorily through history books. I deserted you, Yiddish. You tinted the Polish tongue with your irrepressible inflection that was considered a flaw. Rivulets of contempt know no horizon. They drain self-respect. They murmur cruel subtleties. Jewishness. I perch on the edge, condemned to contradictory feelings. So, as we walked from the train station, it's more than 20 years ago, when she saw the pointing Jesus Christ, and he's still standing there pointing. I saw him on Saturday. She got her bearings. She got her orientation. And then she knew how to find her way home to her house. Of course, nobody was there. Nobody is there. And even the row, and I can understand why she was confused now, because of just 2 years ago, somebody, well, it's a long story as stories are long, but again, because of people who do the work of archiving. There's a Mr. Ajatsky who collects old photographs. And through Marian Feldman, who I believe contributed something of his father's to this museum. That's a lovely story about finding Marian Feldman, thanks to the internet. He had no idea that my mother survived. People didn't know that anybody from Sławin family survived.
People here in Poland.
Zalel Perechodnik didn't know that anybody from Sławin family. It says in the book, nobody survived. Mother wasn't able to come back. She didn't want to come back. When she knew that everybody had been killed, she heard she didn't want to come back. It was painful. She had to forget to go on, to live in the present, you know. And what would she have returned to? What would she have returned to? It's a painful question. I wish she could be here with me now to see what there is to return to. Kindness, solicitude, you know, as she said, I choose to believe in the better angels of our nature, as Barack Obama used to like to quote Abraham Lincoln, right? But so it's that pointing statue. So then we walked under the tunnel, she called it, and came up to the corner of Warszawska 17 and Kościelna, ulica Kościelna. And her parents, the row of stores that was there, it no longer stood in 1994. But behind that was the house she grew up in. They lived in an apartment building, small, two stories. When she lived there, there was a little town jail on one of the floors. But they lived on the what you call in Poland the first floor, you know. And I have a photograph of her with her aunt and her that lived with them, and her aunt and her twin brother, very sweet, standing against a balcony, and you see the trace of the Schwiedermeyer woodwork. But we went inside, just into the entryway, but we didn't dare knock. I'm sorry now that we didn't knock on the door. There was I think a lawyer had an office there in 94. But I don't think I could bear it either. And she couldn't certainly see the rooms. But now I regret it, because when I came back, so I went in 94 with my mother just for a week. And then I came back in 97, I was teaching in Slovenia, so it was easier for me. And we had holidays for Zaduszki. And but I didn't know anybody. But I was received very sweetly by some children in, I think they were in kindergarten. I made my way to the Pomnik, you know, there is a memorial in Otwock. And again, I have so much respect for the energy and initiative of somebody. Somebody took it upon himself, I'm presuming him, to acknowledge that something happened. And I'm grateful. I don't know exactly when it happened. I think in the 1950s. But to my great surprise, when I made my way, because I knew how to get there, because mother and I had gone there in 94. I'll never forget how, when she saw the Pomnik, she bent and embraced it like this, and Mother, she wrote a poem about that. Not that moment, but you see, my father came, he went to Poland in 1977. And
but your parents, they knew each other from before the war, or they met after the war?
Not in a million years, no, they wouldn't know each other. My father grew up in Kraków and my mother in Okhotsk.
So
That's a
then
world away.
in that
Yes, in Gnadenwald. My mother ended up there when she tried to go back to Poland in 1945. She was liberated by the Russians in Bodenbach, not far from Dresden, and they walked, she and her friend. But you know what was happening in 1945. There was terrible chaos. In May, terrible chaos, terrible devastation. And when it was more than rumor, she met somebody who had buried her parents in the mass grave. She said, I don't remember his name. And I couldn't, when I asked her for these kinds of details, she would get very angry. Why do you need to know such gruesome details, she would say. Well, I needed to know for the record, because I suppose I have a historian's rigor. My father was much more systematic and rigorous. But when it became clear that, and these are her words really, that there's nothing there. Because, her German teacher had taken over the bookstore. You know how Jewish property was confiscated. I'm afraid that was a bitter story for my mother. The story goes that my grandmother begged the teacher to give her books from the lending library so that people would at least have some distraction in the ghetto. Literacy saves our lives because it has the power to transport us. There's a wonderful American poet, Emily Dickinson, 19th century poet. She writes, there is no frigate like a book to take one out to sea. It goes like that. It's a wonderful poem. And my father's story at Auschwitz is all about how literacy in German saved him. And I do want to get to that because that is a story that really pays homage to Pan Stefan Piotrowicz, whose family, there are no direct descendants alive anymore. His daughter died in 2006. He himself perished at Mauthausen. And my father is probably one of the last people to see him alive. So it's a sacred duty. But his, I think, great-nephew contacted me, thanks to the internet again, 2 years ago. And so we're going to meet the family, his surviving family. And our generation of young people and his generation of young people will meet each other on Sunday coming. I can only think that my father would just, when I tell you his story. So one more poem about from Mother, because it's tender. And then this, when my father went to Poland in 1997, and of course for him it was such a journey of discovery. He never went back to Poland for several reasons. He was liberated at a satellite camp of Mauthausen at Gunskirchen by the Americans in May 5th, 1945. those were holidays in our family. May 5th for Mother by the Russians and May 5th for Father by the Americans. They never forgot. My father didn't go back because he knew that nobody survived, number one. And he came from a bourgeois family, so he didn't imagine that the new regime would be very friendly to him. My parents had no illusions about Stalin. And they didn't want to live under Stalin.
But your mother, her parents, her family was more like
Bundist, yeah, of course. But they knew about the doctor trials in the 30s. People knew, people were traveling after all. Scholemash visited their lending library. There's quite a story. I don't know what offense he caused in their lending library, but apparently, according to Yiskor, Allah Swabin gave him what to. I don't know what he might have said. And no less than Isaac Singer went to the lending library there in Okhotsk. And he promises, the story is very funny actually.
But it's a story that it's...
Isaac Singer, no, my mother had no idea about it. If she'd known, I'm sure we went to visit, after he won the Nobel Prize for Literature, he was speaking at Harvard University. He was very acclaimed, you know. And my mother and I went to hear him. And I remember that she addressed him. I don't remember whether she addressed him. I think she addressed him in Polish because she was very proud of her pure Polish language, her educated Polish language. I'm sure only a Polish person can understand what that means. And I remember his absolute surprise when she addressed him. But I don't think that she had any idea that in his memoir, maybe he didn't write his memoir yet, that he makes a rather passing reference to Swabin's bookstore. It's quite humorous, if you want to call it that. He was a rather notorious for his love of ladies. And he had a lady here, there, and everywhere. And so he goes, the story goes that he and his lady friend had a summer place in Okhotsk, for the air. That's what people did. And he went to make his rounds in Warsaw. This is his account, not mine. I just happened to read it just a few years ago. But that's another interesting Okhotsk connection. You see, Okhotsk has, I don't know, there's a spirit about Okhotsk. It has its, call it a kind of magnetism maybe. Because I went to visit a woman, she's not young anymore, Halina Moss, who had also a childhood in Okhotsk and remembers my grandparents' lending library. And I went to visit her in Glasgow. She survived because her family fled east. And it's, another minor miracle that they survived. And then eventually she went after the war to Glasgow. But when I went to visit her in January of 2017, she said, "Oh, if I'm not mistaken, Isaac Singer mentions your grandparents' lending library." And sure enough, there he is, Isaac Singer, leaving for the day to go to Warsaw, promising his amour, his amante, his lover, or his wife, I don't know what, that he would bring her books and food and supplies. But of course, he goes off to Warsaw and he visits the Writers' Club and he gets involved. He's not very explicit about it, but clearly he was making his rounds. And he doesn't return until very late to his to Otfotsk. And as he's walking from the train, he describes how he's walking from the train station to their rented room, and he says to himself, "Oh, I'll make it up to my sweetheart, to my gal. I'll take her for breakfast tomorrow, and I will take her to Swavin's bookstore and buy her a book." So that's the reference to my maternal grandparents' bookstore. But do you want to know how the story ends? I'll let you read it. It's quite interesting. But anyway, here's Mother's poem about the pomnik in Otfotsk. Mother's Day. A gray slab, an afterthought, rests on that morning of August 19, 1942. The bullets that killed you made my survival a crime. I reach into the mass grave. Mama, tell me I'm a good girl.
Very strong.
Survivor guilt is very potent in people. We call it now post-traumatic stress disorder. There is science about it. Why isn't there preventing war? Why isn't there a universal generosity towards one another? Why is there such greed? You probably know the poem of Julian Tuwim, to the Simple Man. My mother translated that. It was written in, I think, the 1920s, and apparently it was suppressed because it was considered too radical. But what's radical about seeing plainly that war is often a function of making munitions, the munitions industry, richer, and at the cost of social programs and social welfare. That poem is as prescient today as it was almost 100 years ago. I don't have the translation with me, but you can find that. Do you remember what it's called in Polish? It's something about a człowiek. No, it's more, it has a marvelous rhythmic Polish title that I can't summon in me. Do prostego. You got it. That's his poem. Look it up. But anyway, do we have time to tell my father's story?
Yes.
Because that is the most powerful thing. It's also Mother was a spirit. No, they did not know each other before the war. They met after the war in DP camp. And my mother charmed my father because the story goes how they met. I love romantic stories. How did your parents meet? Don't you want to know how your parents met? Is it a romantic story? I hope so. Mm-hmm. You know? The story goes, my mother was in the displaced persons camp at Gnadenwald in Austria. And there was gathered there. Mother was very colorful, the flotsam of survivors, the people of all kinds. But among them was this man of small stature who was very respected. And the word in the DP camp was that he came from the word was that he came from a good family in Krakow and that he had been very decent to people in concentration camp. You know, after the war, what happened? People were taking justice into their own hands. But my father was treated with great respect, and my mother, of course, she was Stella Swavin. She wasn't my mother then, but Stella Swavin began to be aware of this small man. Also, he was very purposeful. The first thing he did after the war was to go to university. He presented himself in Innsbruck. He wanted to continue, to resume his education. He had been a medical student at Jagiellonian. He loved his university. He was very proud to be a student of Jagiellonian. He points out it was one of the oldest universities in the whole of Europe. Second oldest, he claims. So she was aware of this man, and one day, the story goes, he was pushing a bicycle up the mountain, and mother, not mother then, Stella Swavinovna, was coming down the mountain. And she, I think by her own telling, rather coyly asks him, "Do you happen to know what time it is?" That's a way of beginning a conversation, isn't it? Classic, right? And of course, he became interested. "Why do you need to know the time?" And she explained to him that she's going to a concert. Because after the war, life resumed, and it was the French zone, and they heard Cortot and Jacques Thibault, all the great preeminent, Henrik Schering, I think, did he perform there? I don't remember, but that's the story. So, my mother, in that way, proved her bona fides, you could say, as a woman of a certain education. So that's how it began. But my tatush, we should.
Can you tell what is your father's name?
Yes, of course. His name is Victor Penser. But he made this book under his nom de guerre, his false paper name, Yusef Charsky. He got the baptism certificate from, I think maybe even from Charsky's parents, because Charsky, if I have the story correct, was killed very early in the war. He may have been in one of the cavalry divisions.
And when he wrote that, it's like a memoir?
It really is. You know, again, as people age, like this Theodore Hamerow, who wrote this lovely memoir, as people age, they see their mortality ebbing, and they feel need to make a kind of testimony, give witness. It's not uncommon that people at end of life feel a need to tell their stories, and I'm glad they do, because I have been blessed. Marian Feldman wrote his autobiography, and I found photographs in his autobiography that I had never seen before of Stella. May I show the photo before we go on with my father? It's such a sweet photograph. And then I went to meet Feldman, and of course we've kept in touch. I saw him on Tuesday. Abracadabra! I was looking for Hamerow's book on the internet because I needed to buy a copy. And so I did a keyword search for Okhotsk. Abracadabra! All of a sudden, what do I find? Shall I bring it? You do it, or you can do it. Now, who is that little girl holding a book? Even at 4 or 5 years old, she is the true daughter of Shaya Iala Swavin.
So that's your mom.
It says here, Marian and Janina Feldman. Here they are, these two children, and Stella and Lolek Swavin in Okhotsk, circa 1927. My goodness, can you imagine my astonishment? And then as I read the description, if I buy the book, I can find a photograph. Regina and Ignacy Feldman, and parents of Stella and Lolek Swavin in Okhotsk, circa 1927. And sure enough, here is Marian's Ignacy. Here is Ignacy Feldman, his father, and his mother, Regina. But look who's here. Allah, my grandmother. I'm named for her. That's my middle name. And behind her is Shaya Swavin. Now, if that isn't a miracle, in 2011, to find Marian's book, and within seconds, well, first thing, of course, I did was call my mother, who was living by then with my sister. Mother, look on the computer. There's a photograph of you. And then thanks to the computer, I found Marian's.
May I see?
Oh, of course.
Just to look at.
It was translated into English, from Polish, of course. Within minutes, I found his son, Richard Feldman, who lives in Massachusetts. And then I had to visit them once we got connected. And when I visited Marian, I said, why did you include the photographs of Stella and Lolek? He found them among his father's trove of photographs. And he said, well, the reason I included them in the book is that I remembered the names of the twins, because you can imagine at, 80 years distance, what do I remember from 80 years ago? I don't remember anything because I haven't lived that long, but memory dims. But you see what a gift. Books are a real gift.
Yeah.
So the records are important. Nobody should feel that his efforts are in vain. Even if you just publish things on your own, you don't need a publisher. You just say, I want to make a book. And so that's what I did. I make books. It's not that complicated. But anyway, you were asking about my father, and that's part of my purpose in traveling right now. Well, there are two reasons that I am traveling again to Poland. This is my 6th trip to Poland, because I started to say I came in 97, then again in 98 in the spring, but I didn't come to Otwock. I just stayed in southern Poland. I was teaching in Slovenia, and it was easier to come just for the weekend. And then I want to say that I came in 1999, with my German friend, one of my very close German friends, whom I met at this convocation at Auschwitz, for whom I have utmost respect. Heidrun Hartmann. She was raised in a small town during the Second World War, not far from Munich. And in her adult life, she has been singularly willing to face the realities of what happened during the Second World War, and to do the work of reconciliation, of moving beyond atrocity, which I think is a work for all of us to do, because everybody has a work of what's the word? None of us is without blemish. All of us have made misjudgments, and every nation. It just seems to be in the nature of nationhood that we usurp. And the tragedy is that those who usurp, who are usurped, usurp in turn. Those who are dispossessed often dispossess in turn. This is true in many places, not certainly in my own country. And we have a work of recognition of Native people to do that is long overdue. And it's in no small part my personal family history that gives me such a strong identification and supports such efforts in my own community to name the sacred places of people who lived there 300, 400 years ago. The human condition, not for the faint of heart. But yes, my father felt a need to write his memories of his childhood in Krakow. And of course, he loved Krakow. He was a loyal native son. He says in his in his own interviews, I am a Polish patriot, no question. He certainly, he certainly was. Okay, so let's fast forward to his, you know, like people of his age, when the war broke out in 1939, they were told to mobilize, to go east to mobilize and resist the German onslaught. Well, he tried, you know, but couldn't find anybody to, you know, he and his brother and his father took off to join the Polish army. But they didn't know where to go. They didn't find anybody. And so that becomes another story. But somehow, you know, he was, as the conditions changed and the Nazi occupation in its brutality intensified, he was young and very energetic, and my father was not a passive person. He was very enterprising, and one of the things that he wanted to do was to help people run away. So he was procuring false papers for people. And he had false papers himself. When he was caught, you know, these are wonderful stories. I mean, they're not stories. Story, in a way, diminishes it. I mean, this is his personal history. These are not tales. I could even read you that, because this is the story of a schoolmate of his. My father was in Krakow in the winter of 1943, maybe. I would have to read this. Do we have time for all of this? Maybe not.
For some of it, of course.
But what do you want to hear? Because this is, well, what is most important, since you are interested in how people cooperated with each other and extended a hand to each other under circumstances which were perilous. The irony upon ironies is that going to Auschwitz by no means a given that it saved his life. Because you see, when he was arrested, he was arrested under false papers. He had the name and identity of Józef Czarski. He was in a Polish, I don't know whether, my father wrote it down, I just don't remember, was it Gestapo headquarters? I don't know where he was being interrogated. It was pretty dreadful. But one of the guards recognized him. They'd been in school together. My father had gone to a Christian school, because nobody had the heart to kick him out. He was just well liked, and even though in Krakow too it was separate but equal, but somehow when it was discovered as a little boy that he's Jewish, because he lived in a quarter that was not particularly Jewish. On the contrary, he had a teacher that liked him so much and said, well, if you kick him out, I'm going to resign. So he just stayed. And but he had a schoolmate who recognized him in the prison. And, you know, a good turn a good turn returns, because apparently this man who recognized him hadn't been a good student, and my father was one of the ones who would pass along his homework. So to this guy, when he recognized my father, found a way. He ordered my father to clean the floors in some high reach of the prison, in some off corridor place in the prison, so that he could have a word with him and say, look, I happen to know that if you stay here, political prisoners will be summarily killed. But if you confess that you're Jewish, I happen to know that there's a transport going to Auschwitz. And at least there's a chance for you to escape. And my father had escaped before from a transport earlier in the war, before they started sealing the cars, the cattle cars. So my father, being energetic and enterprising, took the risk on the advice of his schoolmate, former schoolmate. So that's a story, or a personal history. We should find the name of the schoolmate and give him due credit, shouldn't we?
Yeah.
I think I could find it pretty easily. As you see, my father was very systematic. And he wanted the story to be known. He wanted people to get due credit. Yeah, he says everything here, what happened. He was delivered by Kriminalpolizei to the jail inside the Jewish ghetto. That's after he confessed. Janek is his name. Let me see. Yeah. If I can find it. No, that's probably before. Is it? Yes, that's very important to find it.
But do you have that memoir also like in digital form?
No, I do not. But my friend said, well, where am I finding it? Let's see. Yeah, he's just talking about the interrogation here, blah, 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 blah. Jan Cichota. Is that a Jan? Yes.
Yes, Jan.
Here, you can read it.
Jan Cichota, yes.
Cichota.
Chi.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
But he said, you see, he was, this is not the correct name, because, and I'll tell you why. It said about Cichota, my father is protecting him because having become a traitor, his surname has been altered here. You see, I guess he was collaborating with the Germans under those circumstances. And after the war, nobody in his hometown knew what happened to him. Had he survived as a traitor, he would have been tried in a court and probably sentenced. But this man, you see, these are the stories. These are the lessons that my parents taught us. that we're not good or bad because of the accident of our births, what pedigree we have, or what lineage we have, but because of what choices we have and we make in our conduct. And even that isn't easy. Sometimes we do things that we think the better of. Conscience isn't always, we don't always listen to our consciences. So let me find the story that was told to us all our lives, and we have the account in my father's own voice. Just before a year before he died, talking about Pan Pietrovich. And then I'm sure, Yusef, you're very tired of all the things that I've been telling you. I think you must be exhausted.
No, I'm really amazed. I'm not tired. Oh.
Well, so he ends up at Auschwitz, and you know the story of Birkenau, the conditions there. Hard labor, typhus, and my father was in a very weakened condition. So he is registered there in March of 1943. He's given the numbers 108, 268. My mother always used to say them in Polish. How do you say them? How do you say 108, 268? Jeden. Nas? No.
108 and?
108, 268.
268.
But she didn't say it like that. She said it 100,008 to 100,008 268. She said it correctly.
It was
108 268. I believe that's it. If memory serves me.
So it's 100,008 268.
That's how she said it. Thank you. Mama, she was very funny. Oh, mother. Dear to me. Okay. Well, I think this is the short story. I'll read this. In the book, actually, like with any account of one's life, you tell it, certain stories or accounts you repeat over and over again. Those things that are so vital to your sense of who you are. You tell the stories that define you and define your life. You tell them over and over again, and inevitably different aspects of the story are emphasized. So when I was editing the book, when I was making the book, I thought it was interesting to repeat the story I think twice I did, because it was always so essential to my father. This is a story called The Judge. Oświęcim is a small town in southern Poland on the border of two regions. How do you pronounce it? Śląsk. There's no w, yeah. Śląsk. Silesia and Małopolska, Poland Minor, some 60 kilometers west of Kraków. Because of course in this story, he's also educating people. He wants people to know. He anticipated that English-speaking people would read the book and not have any idea of his beloved Poland. The town was called Auschwitz by the Germans. It is this name that is engraved in the history of humanity as a symbol of methodical genocide. It achieved fame as the most severe of Nazi concentration camps, even before mass extermination facilities were constructed. For the prisoners, the smokestacks of the crematorium were the only reprieve from torment. In the gas chambers and crematoria, between 1.5 and 2 million people were dispatched to the heavens. The smell of burning flesh, human flesh and bones, permeated the air day and night. The flames and clouds of thick black smoke surging skywards seemed to mock God himself. Some of the prisoners survived to bear witness, I among them. Why I was spared, the only one of more than 1,200 men and women delivered that day in March 1943, I have no satisfactory answer. In these surroundings where cruelty was the norm, nobility of character must be recognized. Pan Pietrowicz was a prisoner at KL Auschwitz II. Auschwitz-Birkenau, reputedly the worst of the three camp complexes. I shall never forget our first encounter. It was August or September of 1943. After months of hard labor, inadequate rest, prolonged malnutrition, repeated physical abuse, and a bout of typhus, my resistance was in rapid decline. Ask for a job in the infirmary, Dr. Wiesenfeld suggested when we met one evening after work. He held the position of Blockpfleger, caretaker of the sick. You will not last much longer at hard labor. Dr. Zenkteller is looking for a new man. Tell him that you were a medical student before the war. He is a brute, but you must take the chance. He hates me, so I can't appeal to you on your behalf. Edek, that must be Dr. Wiesenfeld, and I had shared a jail cell for several weeks at Krakow ghetto before the transfer to Auschwitz and had become good friends. I followed his advice. I approached the doorman of the infirmary humbly. Sir, I was a medical student before the war, and I've been told that Dr. Zenkteller is looking for a good worker. What? He barked, get lost before I smash you. From his raised fist, I could see he had no hesitancy to implement this threat, and I fled. The same evening, however, after curfew, a heavenly messenger arrived in the person of the infirmary registrar. Tomorrow morning you must report to the infirmary instead of marching out to work. Your Blockpfleger will bring you there. Of course, all of this takes place in Polish and German, so here we are, my father's account of it in English language. But I don't doubt its precision. That was my father's nature, precision. In Auschwitz, well, he had to be precise. He became a dentist after the war, and to be a good dentist, when you have people's health in your hands, it requires precision. In Auschwitz, it was dangerous to disobey and just as risky to ask questions. Next morning, I was guided to Block 31, the infirmary, together with a bunch of sick prisoners. In front of the entrance, 12 to 15 other prisoners and I were lined up by the doorman, whom I'd met before. You again, he grumbled, but he made no effort to hit me this time. He placed me at the very end of a line whose only common denominator was that we'd been registered as Krankpfleger on arrival at Birkenau. This I gleaned later That's how we became candidates for the job vacancy. The common wisdom, of course, was, and I'm sure other people have told you, that if you had a skill, you declared it. It was safer to have a skill, and some people had to make it up. But anyway, and in this case, it was absolutely true. My father had been a medical student. Standing in line under the watchful eye of the doorman, who kept us in readiness, we were not permitted to talk with one another. It was a long wait. After all the sick had been taken care of and dispatched, Dr. Zenkteler, the universally dreaded chief physician himself, dreaded physician, himself a prisoner, emerged from the infirmary. He went right to the business of interviewing us. He had the face of a bulldog. He barked his questions in German. He dismissed the others perfunctorily with a slap of his palm or the punch of his fist. Any reply other than ja, yes, or nein, no. Any attempt to explain seemed to tax his endurance. The slightest irritation triggered verbal abuse and physical attack, terminating the interview. That's something my father always said, that as he to survive, you had to be very observant. And he saw that if you were in any way ingratiating or too verbose with your answers, you were knocked aside, you know. Strict discipline. When he came to the prisoner at attention next to me, he scrutinized the man. He asked nothing. A Dutchman, eh? You're too tall and too skinny. Get lost. He gestured with a kick. Now I was face to face with him. He looked me over. Where are you from? Krakow. What were you before the war? Medical student. Where? Jagiellonian University. What years? 1937, 1939. Can you write German well? Yeah, yes. We shall see. Vinogradov, he summoned the doorman. Tell Pietrovich to determine his qualifications. I followed Vinogradov inside. The office of the infirmary was to the right of the entrance. Dr. Zenkteler wants you to test him. Vinogradov addressed a neatly dressed, middle-aged, distinguished-looking prisoner in Polish. In turn, Pan Pietrovich invited me with a welcoming gesture. This is taking place in Polish, mind you. My name is Pietrovich, and yours? Kindly sit down at the desk. I could hardly believe my ears. This was not the manner of concentration camp. Please take a pen, he pointed, and write down what I will dictate. Dr. Zenkteler requires someone who can write German flawlessly. Can my stiff hands hold and guide a pen? The disturbing thought went through my mind. My fingers were swollen, but I forced myself to grip the pen. My life was at stake. Just then, Dr. Zenkteler's face peeked through the window at Pan Pietrovich, as Pan Pietrovich started reciting a poem by Friedrich Schiller, a poem which I loved and knew by heart. And can you read German well? Yusuf?
Me?
Ja.
No, I can.
Festgemacht in der Erden, steh die Form aus Lehm gebrannt. Pardon my terrible German. Heut muss die Glocke werden, frisch gesellen, I don't know, Zeit zur Hand. Slowly, with effort, I wrote the words and continued the verse aloud. Von der Stirne heiß rinnen muss der Schweiß. Senchteler's voice intruded. Son of a bitch, how sly. He found out what you were going to ask him, Pietrovich. Ask him to write something else. Pan Pietrovich calmly took the paper on which I'd written, glanced at it, handed it without a word to Dr. Senchteler. He then retrieved from hiding a page of newspaper. You know, newspapers were strictly forbidden there. Please, he turned to me, write the following. He dictated several sentences. When I finished writing, Dr. Senchteler, still hanging at our necks, Pan Pietrovich reviewed it. Flawless, he confirmed, and handed it over to Dr. Senchteler, who responded with a loud command. And that's how he got the job. Before we left, Pan Pietrovich extended his hand to me. Welcome to the infirmary. And then he tells the story of Pietrovich, where they were maintaining patient records. We prepared reports for the authorities. We kept statistics. We did all the paperwork. We always obeyed the commands of Dr. Senchteler, whom we tried to avoid as much as possible. During clinic hours in the morning and the evening, we were rushed. The block flagger of each barrack was authorized to bring his sick, injured, or crippled for diagnosis or re-examination by Dr. Senchteler or his deputy, Dr. Wortmann, who was Jewish, as it were, whom I met later in New York, who came to New York. Otherwise, there was time for conversation. Pan Pietrovich, in his civilian life, had gained national recognition as a judge in his native city of Gniezno. Gniezno is located in the region of Wielkopolska, Poland Major, on the site where Piast, the progenitor of Poland's royal dynasty, spotted the nest of a white eagle. From then on, the symbol of Poland. Gniezno was the capital of Mieczysław I, Pierwszy, how do you say?
Pierwszy, tak, Mieszko Pierwszy.
Thanks. Who, at the end of the 10th century, accepted Christianity as the national religion. Pietrovich, prominent in Narodowa Demokracja, is that it?
Yes.
National Democracy, a nationalist party, was well known for his political activities inter bellum. As a Polish patriot, his presence in Gniezno was untenable for the German authorities. Jailed initially, he was eventually dispatched to Auschwitz, leaving behind a wife and daughter, his only child, at home. Before World War I, Pietrovich studied law at the University of Berlin, where he became acquainted with another Pole, a student of medicine, Roman Senchteler. Under the Second Republic, Senchteler became a physician in the Polish army. With the German invasion in 1939, Senchteler was captured. He became a head doctor, well known as a collaborator, and for his sadistic treatment of prisoners. But I believe he was acquitted after the war, tried and acquitted. I believe that. So who knows? When Pietrovich arrived at Auschwitz, Senchteler recognized him and gave him a clerk position in the infirmary. In this role, Pan Pietrovich treated infirmary personnel, block flaggers, patients, prominent or ordinary, with equal courtesy and concern. He was respected in turn by those who had the privilege of knowing him. Though Bardin, that was his comrade, a Frenchman, whom my father adored, Jewish, who just disappeared after they were sent on the transports. To my father's eternal grief, he looked for Daniel Bard forever and never found a trace of him. Though Bard and I had to be away from the infirmary on various errands, Pan Petrovich stayed in the office most of the time, except first thing in the morning. He was assigned the body count. He had to walk around the periphery of the men's camp to identify those who had died at night from touching the electrified barbed wire or being shot by guards. Concentration camp prisoners other than Jews were permitted to receive packages from relatives or friends. No one received more or better than Pan Petrovich. They came not only from family, but many of his admirers. He always shared what he got with the rest of us. In the infirmary of, the notation is B2D. I don't know what the designation is, but this is a camp designation. Pan Petrovich had a chance to survive. However, with the progress of the Russian offensive, we were evacuated from Auschwitz on a death march in January of 1945. New hardships had to be overcome. I managed to keep contact with Pan Petrovich all through the transport until we reached KZ, I think, Mauthausen in Austria. There we got separated. Weeks elapsed before we met again. I was in Melk in the hospital of one of the satellite labor camps. I was recovering there from a head injury. The first warm day of spring, I stepped onto the balcony into the sunshine. Pan Petrovich was there. He was very ill. Pan Petrovich was there. He was very ill. His digestive system no longer functioned and he could not eat. He was in constant pain. He had no self-pity, only concern for his wife and daughter. Yet he was confident that his many friends would assist them. When I searched for him a few days later, I was told that he had passed away right there in Melk on the blue Danube River. If there is a special place in heaven for the souls of the just, among angels, that's where the soul of this noble man can be found. I know.
So, but you said that you met the family.
I met Wanda when I was in his daughter. You see, she had contracted polio during the war. My father knew this from Petrovich, and of course he was very concerned for his daughter. And in the tape, I have the recording of my father. I told you about.
Yeah.
And I somehow forgot this about a story or about how my father found them. In this tape, he cries. He says, "It took me 50 years to find them because on this man's deathbed, he gives my father a trust." And for 50 years, he was looking for him, for the family. And finally, he found them. And he says that he finally had the inspiration to contact a judge in Poznan. And the judge had known Petrovich before the war. So it was what? I don't know, maybe not 50 years, but maybe, I don't know exactly when. Maybe it was 50 years because I went to see her in 1999. So it would have been 50 years. I went with my German friend I told you about, Heidrun. When we went to my mother's hometown for the commemoration or the remembrance of the liquidation in August 19th. There was no, it was just a personal remembrance. We went. My mother always spoke about the pine forests of Okhotsk. She characterized it as the velvet air of Okhotsk. And of course it was known for its salubrious air, for its healthy air. And it's true, when I was bicycling last Saturday, I smelled the velvet air of Okhotsk. It's like hearing the cuckoos for the first time. You know, in the United States, we don't have cuckoos. You never forget. But Wanda, so I went to see, I have a photograph of her in Gniezno. We should show this. And we kept in touch for a little while, but then I didn't hear anything. And then 2 years ago, I heard an email, thank goodness, from a Pietrovich. Now, when I see a name Pietrovich, I don't just dismiss it. I look and see what it is. This cannot be what we call spam. You know, I opened it, and sure enough, "Dear Mrs. Penser, are you by any chance the daughter of Victor Penser?" I couldn't believe it. I told my mother, and she was still at a point that she recognized the name. And so it began a correspondence. And when I knew that I'm coming, I wanted to go to Poland because my father is turning 100 years old on July 18th. And what do you do when your father turns 100 years old? You go to the places that he loved. So I thought, let's go to Orski. What's it? Okomorsky, is that it? Oko?
It's
yeah, in Zakopane.
Yeah, Morskie Oko, yeah.
Yeah, Morskie Oko.
Yeah. Yeah, sure.
So that's where we have to go next week. And so I contacted Pan Pietrovich. That was one of the reasons that brought me here now. And also, when they released the film "Who Will Write Our History," about the archives, the Ringelbaum archives, I think that there's a photograph in their archives of my mother, which is so rare to recognize anybody in those photographs. I saw it this morning, when I went to the exhibit. And
but did you tell the staff of the Tishik?
They have experts who can determine these things.
They will.
Maybe so.
No,
But a daughter knows her own mother. Maybe yes, maybe no. It's the resemblance is so remarkable. I can show it to you. Maybe do I have it? I picked up the brochure. It's of these people raising money for help in the ghetto, Pomoc. And I have a photograph of my mother, her high school graduation photograph made in 1939, and then I have a photograph of her from 1949. And of course, people in ghetto were, you know, she's cowering. Of course she's cowering. It was a German photographer. Probably. Huh. You didn't look full face at a German photographer, did you? You know the consequence for that. But anyway, let me find Wanda. And then, Youssef, I think you have been a wonderful listener, and you must be very tired, but maybe I could also show a photograph of my mother's letter that I read earlier. And
yeah, but just a bit further. Just
oh, I see. You know the...
It's too close.
Oh, too close. Okay.
I
These
will
things
just
are very... And her twin brother, Lolek. And where did I find that photograph? My cousin had it in her log cabin in Montana. I went to visit her. Yeah. This is Lolek, who was killed. But somebody hid him in Falenica, and I would love to find who is the family who harbored him, who hid him away in 1942 when he ran away from the ghetto. I don't know, and I have a depth of gratitude to them. Even the story goes that he became very lonely and went out onto the street, and somebody recognized him and just killed him in cold blood. It was, you know, those are the kinds of things that happen sometimes. People were not always merciful. And let us be merciful in our own day. But let me see if I might be, I hope I can find. There's Wanda. This is Wanda Pietrovich, whom I met, because my father wanted her to know what a deeply decent man he is. He wanted her to know that his dying thoughts were of her and concern for her and her mother. I have one more photograph of her with her friends.
Okay.
Wanda, piękna, sympatyczna. Can you say that?
Sympatyczna.
Yeah, you see? I know important words in Polish. And here she is with her friends. So I had made the book, my father's book, and I wanted her to have a copy of the book where my father remembers her father.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. And so now when I go to visit Poznań and Gniezno, we will pay our respects.
Thank you very much for your time and your story. I think it's very important because me personally, there are always two things that we are looking for in, let's say, in oral history. And one thing is, of course, there are defects and but it's for me also it's very important the experience, and that's why I also wanted to talk with you to hear your emotions and your perspective. And I think you said a lot of very important things in general. And do you want to add something at the end anything you want to say, just whatever you think it's important and hasn't been said. Is there something? No, it's you can say whatever you want.
Two things. First, I am very grateful that we live in a time that we can reach out to each other in solidarity. We have to find a better way, but we cannot do it alone. We have to listen to each other as you so patiently listen to me. We have to work out our differences of opinion without rancor, without violence. It takes a lot of self-discipline to hear things that make us uncomfortable, that make us feel defensive. But I think in engaging with each other with honesty, it's the only way forward. It's, you know, Jesus himself said, "Love thine enemy." And what a discipline that is. What does he mean? So that's one thing I have to say. Dziękuję. I'm grateful to the people who are willing to reclaim Polish history in its fullness. I'm grateful to people who extend themselves to me as you all have. I look forward to introducing my niece and my nephew to Poland tomorrow for the first time. This is part of their heritage, after all. At least on our side of the family. Their father is a Brit, an Englishman. But also, I have to say something maybe my mother would say to me, "Marta, don't be so loquacious." She would say, even in her last years, "Our Marta, she is so loquacious." Loquacious, of course, means somebody who talks a lot. But, you know, I would hope that as a person who talks a lot, that I know how to listen deeply.